Well, it looks like it's 7 o'clock, so we're going to get started. I know we've got folks at home online, so good evening. My name is Mark Broman. I'm the Executive Director of the Wachiska Audubon Society. Welcome to our April meeting. I want to welcome everyone that's here in person and those of you joining us online. Wachiska is an independent chapter of the National Audubon with geographical area covering the 17 counties in southeast Nebraska. You can follow us on our website and on Facebook. And I'll ask if our President Teresa Pella has any announcements tonight. I think she had a couple things. Our board meeting's coming up next week, but Teresa, I'll have her come up and give us a couple updates. Here's one, Teresa. Yep. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, you can.
Okay, Teresa's on her way to the microphone here.
Eventually she gets there. Okay, just the only announcement I have is I'm the board president, by the way. Our board meeting is scheduled this coming Tuesday, April 18th at 7 p.m. We do those Zoom, but they are open to anyone who wants to join us. If you'd like to dial in, just let Mark or Arliss know and they'll get you connected. And then the other thing that we have tonight is April, has reworked the brochures, the Wachiska brochures that we've had for years. So we now have the same information, hopefully more tantalizing and attention grabbing for people. So these are our rack cards that we'll be using at all our events for handouts and available to anyone who wants to hand these out, or if you have something coming up that you'd like to take some of these, please do, because this is the new way to get information out there as to who we are as a chapter. And thank you, April and Elizabeth Nelson, if you're out there in cyberspace, thank you also. And Linda and Marilyn also had good input.
Thank you, Teresa. I'm going to ask Dakota to come up and give us a quick update on a 22-minute wetland video that he'll be showing after tonight's presentation. This was something we've been talking about the last couple months, and so we're planning to do that the next couple times, have these videos at the end. So for those of you at home, we'll take a couple-minute break after we have the presentation tonight, the main presentation, and then we'll show that video. So stay with us online. So Dakota, do you want to come up and give us just a little blurb about what we're going to see at the end of tonight, so if people want to stay around and those people at home will want to stay online this is the teaser for what's coming up later.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dakota Altman. I work for Platte Basin Time-Lapse Project, and I'm going to be showing a 22-minute video that PBT and I produced. We produced it over the past 3 years, and we released it recently on the World Wetlands Day on February 2nd. And so I produced this video about the urban wetlands of Nebraska. So it should be exciting. I hope y'all get a kick out of it. Probably won't be as great as Chris Elzer's presentation. But yeah, and I also wanted to mention that Ethan and I just installed a time-lapse camera on one of Wachiska's prairies. So we installed it on Knott Prairie, Tim Knott Prairie in Utan, Nebraska. And that camera won't probably be live on our Platte Basin Time-Lapse website until July, but stay tuned for more updates with that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Arliss, hand me a note not to forget, next month's program is going to be on flying squirrels. There have been some recent flying squirrels discovered on East Campus, and Dr. John Carroll is going to come and give a presentation on flying squirrels, so be sure and not miss next month's presentation. I think we'll take a few minutes now and see if there are any unusual bird sightings, anything rare or unusual that folks have seen. I know some stuff have been coming back and some people have been out at the lakes. Anybody have anything exciting to report at their feeders or out in the field?
I don't have a bird, but I have a little bumblebee, so they're out and about.
That's good. The bees are out. I see some things starting to bloom. There are dandelions coming out, so that's one of the first flowers. So.
On a little flower, and I thought, oh, but I knew it wasn't a mason bee because
Yep.
it looked like that. But I thought, what is that one?
That's a good reminder. If you're cleaning up your gardens, let things stay just a little bit longer because a lot of those bees are living in those tubes and things and down in the leaves. So if you leave that stuff just a few more weeks longer, some of those things can emerge. So I heard that from the entomologist. No, that's fine. Anything else? Anything else in that area? Common loons? Where at? Everywhere. Okay, see them everywhere. Okay. Anything else? Well, with that, I'll start the announcements. I have a whole list of things. So this Saturday, April 15th, Issa is going to lead a bird field trip at Pioneers Park, and he is going to start at 9 a.m. from the Pioneers Park Nature Center parking lot. So again, that's this Saturday at 9, so if you'd like to go on that birding trip. And also, Tad Paddock Todd is here tonight. Let's see, where's Todd? He's up here in the front. He's led a couple of the field trips lately. We haven't had very good turnout on a couple of them, but so he wanted to kind of get some feedback from people and find out, where members would like to go, what areas they'd like to go, what time of day they would like to go out, and maybe the day of the week. So if you've got some feedback for Todd or me, let us know. I know people have been busy, but if you've got some spots you would like to go to or some places that you think would be a good spot, let Todd or I know, and we'll see if we can't get something going. I know Isa said he might do a couple of field trips too coming up. So anyway, we want to get some people out there when Todd's willing to take us out. This Saturday, Wachiska will have a booth at Lincoln's Earth Day. That's being held at Innovation Campus. That's the old state fairgrounds. They're planning to have it outside, but they're going to let us know tomorrow. If it looks like it's going to be windy and a good chance of rain, and if so, they're going to move it indoors. So don't be afraid of the weather. They're going to have it heck or high water. So come on out to Innovation Campus. That's going to be from 10 to 2. So stop by the Wachiska booth. There's some other groups going to be there. I know Spring Creek's going to be there. Sierra Club, Friends of the Niobrara, folks like that will be there. And then on Sunday, April 23rd, we'll have a booth at the Lincoln Children's Zoo. They're celebrating Earth Day on Sunday, April 23rd from 10 to 2. So that's another celebration. You can stop by. We'll have a booth there. Then on Sunday, April 16th, this weekend, on Sunday, we're going to have a tree cutting event at the Arnold Elementary Prairie. We had one earlier out there and had a good turnout. About 15 people came out, and we cut down a lot of trees, trying to get a lot of trees cleared from there. We'll meet at the parking lot on the west side of the school. It's at Northwest 48th and West Cumming Street. So it's just off of 9 Mile Prairie out there on Northwest 48th. We'll meet from 4 to 6. I'll probably get out there about 3. So if someone wants to come early, you can come as early as 3, but it'll be running from 4 to 6. If you have gloves, tree saws, or loppers, bring them along, but we'll have some extra tools and gloves. And we need cutters and draggers. So if you're not interested in cutting, we need some people to drag those trees. Most of them are about 8 foot or shorter, so they're not huge trees. And we need to pile them up, and then later the city will either chip them or burn them. So we'll need to have them piled up. On Saturday, April 29th, we've got a booth at Pioneer Park Nature Center. They're celebrating their 60th anniversary, and they're calling it the Wild Adventures, and it runs from 1 to 4. So that's on Saturday, April 29th. And these things are listed in the April Babbling Brook, so these things are listed on there also. At this time, I'll ask Bruce. Bruce, you mentioned that you had a couple things you wanted to talk about, getting some volunteers. Bruce and Tim Knott are the co-chairs of the Education Committee. So I know Bruce mentioned he'd like to get some volunteers, so Bruce, come on up and give your plea.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I appreciate it. Just a pitch for anyone who would like to get involved on either of these upcoming dates. I think we probably are set with Earth Day for Saturday, but on the 23rd at the Children's Zoo, they have an event that we could use some help with, and it'll be an activity that kids can engage with. And then again, on the 29th at the Pioneers Park Nature Center with a whole lot of other conservation groups and nonprofits that are conservation oriented from 1 to 4. So if you're inclined that way, give me a call. I'm in the monthly newsletter, but if you don't have that, it's 402-570-3681. And I'll stick around if you want to chat with me after that. I don't think so, but that's a very good question, Lana.
If you're working, there won't be a charge. So if you're actually working at the table, they're allowing workers to come in without a charge. Otherwise, I believe it's $12 for adults now if you don't have a membership.
Even for that event?
I think that the event is within
Okay.
the zoo confines, unless they're putting it the outside. They hadn't decided when I talked to them last. So
I see.
if they have it outside the zoo, there won't be a charge. If they have it in that tented area out there, they haven't decided yet whether they're going to have it out there inside. So they said details to come, and I'm still waiting.
Okay. Well, I'll be glad to be a point person to confirm that if you want to get a hold of me. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. Just a reminder, 2023 is Wachiska's 50th anniversary, and we are planning a celebration for the afternoon of December 3rd at Innovation Campus, and we'll have Doug Talmy as our guest speaker after we have our luncheon. Also tonight, after tonight's presentation, after the second presentation, we've got Chris speaking, and then after that, we've got the wetland presentation. We'll have coffee and treats out in the receiving hall out here. We've had a few people step up and help with arranging treats and setting up and clearing, but we can always use some more volunteers. So if you're interested in helping out at a future meeting or bringing treats, let us know, either Arliss or myself know. We'd be happy to set you up. We have a couple of the Vote with Climate in Mind signs out there. I think that there were still some left, or did we sell them all, Arliss? We got 2 left. So we have, for $10, we have the Vote with Climate in Mind signs. There's a lot of those have propped up all over town, so I'm pretty proud of people getting those signs out. So we do have a couple still out front. So see Arliss or me after the presentation. Be watching your mail for the Birdathon letters. That will be coming out soon. And Wachiska will be taking part in the Give to Lincoln Day, which is May 24th, and the Give Nebraska campaign, which is underway and will run all summer and into the fall. These events are our largest fundraising events, so we always ask people to be sure and think about Wachiska during those events. This is a reminder that tonight's presentation and past presentations are available on YouTube, so you can look those up at any time and share those with your friends. Finally got through all the announcements, and it's my pleasure tonight to introduce tonight's speaker, Chris Helzer. Chris's stepmother, Linda, and his father, Norm, are Wachiska members, and they're both here tonight, and they're regular attendees, and so we're happy to have them here tonight. Chris is the Director of Science for the Nature Conservancy. He lives with his family in Aurora, Nebraska. Chris has a fascinating blog called The Prairie Ecologist that he emails out every week and is full of some great stories and even better photos. So if you're not on this list, I highly recommend joining that. It's a great blog. They're really entertaining stories he has on there, and sometimes he has some of the interns with Nature Conservancy write some stories, but there's always some good things in there, and the photos are even better. Whether it's a fly or a bumblebee or a bison, he's got some really good stuff on there, so I encourage you to check it out. He's also written a couple of books and numerous articles. And tonight he's going to talk about the incredible diversity, the superpower of Nebraska's prairies. So I want to welcome Chris up, and he'll take questions after the presentation. So Chris, I'll let you take it away.
Okay. Ooh, that's loud. Pop me down, Linda. All right, how's that?
You may have to be a little bit cognizant of where that speaker is hanging up.
Okay, I'll remember where the speaker is. You guys remind me if I forget. Also, Linda made the mistake of telling me that I could walk around and she was going to track me with the camera. So I'm going to make that interesting for her. No, so I'm here to talk about prairies tonight. Arliss asked me to get everybody excited about the upcoming season. So that's what I'm going to try to do. But I'm going to start sort of ironically, if I can get this thing to go. Linda! It's, can we try taking it off presentation mode and putting it back on real quick? Just hit escape.
See, this is YouTube Studio.
Yep. Aha!
See, I have to get the clicker over there too.
We good? Yeah. Good. Oh, yeah, lights, thank you. We'll get this figured out, everybody, don't worry about it. Perfect. Okay, so when we built the interstate through Nebraska, I don't know if they did it on purpose or not, but they did a very wise thing, and they put it through all the parts of the state that we didn't really want to brag about, so that people wouldn't move to Nebraska. So we hid all the good stuff off the interstate, which was probably a pretty good idea. And then in Nebraska, as you know, is a really interesting place because we're the home of Arbor Day. We really like planting trees to break up the monotony of that flat horizon that everybody doesn't like. And then, about 20 years later, we get the government to pay us to take the trees out again. It's a really good scam. And most of the reason that people like trees in Nebraska and wanted to plant trees is that they look at this and they think that's what prairie is. And the biggest challenge we have for conservation right now is to show them how to look at prairies and where to look for prairies so that they realize that there's actually something interesting to see, right? Because there are places and times where prairies can be spectacular at a very large scale, but always prairies are interesting if you look close. And of course, prairies are great for skies. We have some of the best skies in the world here in Nebraska. You just have to go out and look. And of course, sunrises and sunsets are also spectacular in the prairies. And there's more topography than people think. And everybody here knows this, right? But the people coming through on the interstate don't know that, which is kind of good because, again, we don't want them all to move here, but we also want their money to help support prairies. So I have to talk about birds because I'm at an Audubon meeting. And prairies are great for the distinctive birds that they have, of course. I'm not even going to name them because you all know what they are, right? If you don't, ask me. So this is a dickcissel, sparrow-sized bird that looks a lot like a meadowlark, right? But if you look at the kind of the brown on the wings especially, and then the size. So it's a dickcissel instead of a meadowlark. Upland sandpiper. And then this is just from last week. This is a sharp-tailed grouse. I was up in a blind at the Niobrara Valley Preserve last week, Nature Conservancy site. And then also saw my first burrowing owl of the year last week, which was kind of fun. And it was hanging out next to this badger hole, which may or may not be its nesting site for the year. I don't know, it's early. And then prairies have a lot of other animals besides birds, obviously. A lot of reptiles and amphibians, but things like earless lizards or lined snakes, which look like garter snakes but aren't quite. Box turtles, of course. And then I almost didn't put bison in the presentation. I got to the end, it's like, wait, I didn't do anything with bison. So I went back and fixed that, and I put way too many pictures of bison in the presentation. So I'm just going to kind of scroll through them because bison are really interesting. The thing with bison, of course, is that they're hard to find because they're not roaming wild on the landscape. There are some places like the Crane Trust and Nature Conservancy and Fish and Wildlife Service that have bison. The Turner Organization has some fantastic ranches in the sandhills with bison on them. But they're not a species that is roaming the landscape anymore, which is a shame. And yet, from a management standpoint, we really can do a lot with cattle, almost everything with cattle that we could do with bison. And we can talk about that later if you want to. But bison still have something about them that is a draw for people. And so we at the Nature Conservancy are still trying to figure this out. I know everybody else is too. How do we use the bison we have to get more people out into prairies? Because it's a pretty spectacular way to be introduced to prairie. And then there's other mammals like deer and badgers, jackrabbits, and then lots of small ones, right? The mice, the voles, the shrews, the ones that fuel a lot of the ecosystem just by being food, but also eat a lot of things, seeds and insects especially. But they're a really important part of ecosystem function. And then we've got insects, butterflies that look like butterflies, moths that look like butterflies, and butterflies that look like moths. And if you look at a butterfly that looks like a moth face to face against a sunrise, then it looks like some kind of weird movie creature robot thing, I think. And there are moths that just look like moths. There are moths that look like bumblebees. There are moths that look like hummingbirds. There are moths that look like airplanes for some reason. And there are moths that look like tree bark. And then there are moths that look like an alien Yeti fuzzy creature from space. And all of them come from caterpillars, some of which look like 1980s hair band members. And of course, there's lots of other pollinators. The one thing I did do a poor job of tonight is including wasps, because I could talk to you for an hour and a half about wasps really easily. I think I have one wasp photo, or later I'll point it out. But bees are really important pollinators. You mentioned the first bumblebee of the year. That's great. I have not seen mine yet, so I'm jealous of you. And of course, there's lots of other bee species. I'm going to talk more about bees in a minute, so I'll scroll through these quickly. But they come in all different shapes and sizes and colors. That's the key point at this point in the presentation. And just to keep Linda awake, I'm going to move.
Actually, your slides are so good, that's what I'm
Oh, man. All right, never mind. I won't move. Grasshoppers and katydids, which again I'll talk about later. Cicadas, things that eat plants, right? Lots of insects out there that eat plants, including things that are called plant hoppers, which makes sense. And the funny thing is that's a plant hopper, and also that's a plant hopper, and they don't really look that similar to me. This looks more like a leaf with trees, or with legs, leaf with legs. Lots of different kinds of predators out there. Dragonflies are an easy one to spot, but there's a lot of other ones like assassin bugs, There are things like damsel bugs. Anybody know what a damsel bug is before just now? They look kind of like assassin bugs. So this assassin bug, if you look at this, sort of the front legs are sort of similar. It's got the same kind of mouthpiece, but this is a damsel bug, not an assassin bug. I just figured that out a year and a half ago because I posted it somewhere and I said it was an assassin bug and I got corrected really quickly. Entomologists are really good at that. Ants. So ants are actually major predators. And I think people forget how important ants are as predators, but they're basically like wolves, except there's way more of them, and they're small. But they're really effective, important predators in an ecosystem, but also they're small and they are prey for other predators. So they play two roles in a really important sense, plus all the soil cycling, nutrient cycling that they do, all those sorts of things. Crab spiders, many of which, like this one, can change color from yellow to white over the period of a day or two, which is kind of fascinating. Wolf spiders might be the best moms in nature. They carry the eggs in a sack for the whole time they have eggs, and then when the eggs hatch, they carry the babies around for a very long time until they eventually go somewhere else. And if you don't like spiders, this is the kind that when you step on it, all kinds of little spiders come out. They weren't inside, they were on top. They were riding on the mom, and you just squish the mom, and now there's lots of babies with no mom. I hope you feel good about yourself. And then there are spiders that spin webs, but actually a lot of them don't, right? All the other spiders I just showed you, none of those are web weavers. They have silk, but they don't make webs. So in Nebraska, we're fortunate because we have everything from tallgrass prairie in the east, this is 9 Mile Prairie, all the way out to shortgrass prairie, although Jerry Steinhauer would say it's shortgrass steppe, not technically shortgrass prairie, it's shortgrass prairie. This is the Cherry Ranch, one of the Nature Conservancy properties out by Harrison, Nebraska. And then in between there, nestled in the middle, of course, is the Sandhills, which is one of the most spectacular grasslands in the world. I think, second largest contiguous grassland landscape in the world now, which has lots of grass, lots of sky, lots of water, and is just a phenomenal spot. It also has a lot of plant diversity, which transitions us nicely into my next part of the presentation, which is I want to talk about ecological resilience just real quick. And to do that, I want to start with sunflowers, obviously. So sunflowers in Nebraska, we have 9 different species of sunflowers. There's a whole bunch of other things that look like sunflowers but that are similar to it. But we have 9 species, 7 of them are perennials, 2 of them are annuals. And there are lots of animals that get a lot of good out of the resources provided by sunflowers. A lot of pollinators, obviously, including this bee, which is a bee that specializes on sunflowers. So it has to have sunflowers around or it doesn't exist. But sunflowers are very generous with their resources. With pollen, nectar, they literally put it on a platter for anybody who wants it. So things like this tree cricket can just come land there and start eating the pollen and sometimes the flower. And because they're so generous, there are predators like crab spiders that take advantage of that because they know that everybody's going to come to the sunflowers and they just have to wait for it. And then later on, after the pollination part is done, sunflowers produce big, nutritious seeds, right? That we enjoy eating. And if you're feeding birds, you're probably putting sunflower seeds out there. Unless you don't like squirrels, then you put safflower seeds out there. Is that still a thing? Is that still the way it works? Yeah. But birds definitely get a lot of good out of sunflower seeds. And then outside of the flowers, the plants themselves are really nutritious and for a lot of different things. This is the plains lubber grasshopper. It's the largest grasshopper species in Nebraska. It's mouse size. It's a great big grasshopper. My dad brought him home one time when he was a soil scientist. He brought him home in a big paper sack. And he said, "Hey, I brought you something." And there was something moving in the sack. I got all excited. I was going to get a new pet, and it was a grasshopper. Today, I would be excited. As a 6-year-old, I wasn't all that excited. But lubbers specialize on forbs. They don't eat grasses. They're called grasshoppers. They don't eat grasses. They eat wildflowers. And primarily, what they eat is sunflowers. So they rely heavily on sunflowers. But also other things eat them, like bison or cattle, because sunflowers, especially when they're young, are very nutritious in the leaves and stems. But even later on in the season, when they start to make flowers, the early buds of flowers, the early flowers have a lot of nutrition in them. And you'll see if you walk through a pasture, you'll see those sunflowers being nipped off just as they're starting to bloom, which is fine as long as they don't get them all. And This is a photo from the Niobrara Valley Preserve in 2012. This is a late summer photo. There was a great big wildfire in the neighborhood up there that burned 70-some thousand acres in 2012, including about 35,000 acres of our Niobrara Valley Preserve. So we have 56,000 acres, 35,000 acres burned. That's more than half if I'm doing my math right. It was a lot. It was a big fire. We weren't really concerned about the prairie because we know prairies are fine with fire. And in fact, what actually had a bigger impact was the drought, not the fire, right? Because 2012 was a very dry year. But either way, it was a stressful event for people, which was the biggest issue we were worried about. It was also stress on prairies, but prairies are good at stress. That wasn't really a problem because they have ways to respond. And in this case, the way that they responded was with sunflowers. And this was true throughout the Sandhills in 2013, but especially at the Niobrara Valley Preserve in that burned area. These annual sunflowers really like sunshine hitting the ground. It makes their seeds germinate, and they'll germinate in big numbers if they get the opportunity. And then because all the other vegetation was weakened by the drought, there was not a lot of competition. Those sunflowers just sort of filled in all the empty space. And when they did that, they provided all those resources we just talked about to support all those species we just talked about, and provided a lot when there wasn't a lot else available. So it was a really important thing that the sunflowers did. And we can replicate this with management. This is one of our bison pastures in the summer after we did a spring fire, and the bison came into that burned area. So they're on a 12,000, these bison are on a 12,000 acre pasture. The burn was like 700 or 800 acres. And that was the best forage for them after the burn. So they all, came in there and grazed it really hard, and it looked like this by midsummer. This is a July photo. Here's an August photo of the same pasture. So sunflowers come in and fill that space. It's just what they do. And they're not alone. There are a lot of other species that do that sort of thing, but sunflowers are easy to see, so it's fun to talk about them. So again, 9 different species of sunflowers in Nebraska. Each of them has a different role that they play. There's a lot of overlap, but there's some differences too. The other thing that's fun with sunflowers is that if you just look at the perennials, they're really spread out over different types of habitats. And so what that means is just about anywhere you go in Nebraska, there will be a sunflower there of some kind, right? So there are different sunflowers at the top of the hill than there are at the bottom of the hill. Eastern Nebraska, western Nebraska, wet sites, dry sites. There's always a sunflower for something, which is nice because of all the resources they provide, but it's also really nice because with climate change, these will move around, but hopefully we'll still have a sunflower in every place. They just might be a different sunflower than we're used to eventually. But we need these from a resilience standpoint. I'll talk about that more in a second. Now I want to talk about milkweed, also focusing on resilience. This is what everybody thinks, not everybody. Everybody outside this room, when they hear milkweed, they think of the big pink ones, right? And that's about it. Everybody here knows that there are 17 different species of milkweed in Nebraska, and they come in all different colors, right? Everybody knew that. Shh, you knew that. Here's my wasp photo, by the way. That's the only one. I'm really embarrassed by that. I just really quick on wasps. So wasps were the originals, and bees and ants both came out of wasps, right? So wasps are the ancestors of bees and ants. Wasps are all pollinators as adults. They all feed on nectar or some sweet substance as adults, but they feed their kids meat, right? So they catch or paralyze or whatever prey, animals, small animals, usually insects, and they feed those to their babies, but the adults are vegetarian. So bees are just wasps that went vegan, and they feed their babies pollen and nectar instead of meat. That's all. They just evolved from wasps. There's about 20,000 wasp species in North America. There's about 4,000 bee species. So the bees are an offshoot. And then ants went the other direction, and they're just wasps that stop flying all the time. So they just fly when they're mating, just for the fun part. All the rest of the time they don't have wings, but they're just wasps that live in the ground and don't fly. But wasps are the originals. So we should celebrate wasps way more than we do. And also most of them are solitary. They're not out to get you. Like paper wasps, like this one, are out to get you if you try to attack their nest or they think you're going to. But otherwise, they don't want anything to do with you. And if you see them on flowers, all they care about is the nectar. That's my stump speech on wasps. Everybody should like wasps way more than you probably do. Anyway, wasps and many other things use milkweed, which is what we're talking about here, as nectar sources. And then there's a bunch of insect species that specialize on milkweed leaves and stems and things like that. And they figured out how to deal with that sticky white latex. It's not sap, it's actually in a different vascular system, it doesn't matter. But it's the sticky white stuff that comes out when you pinch a milkweed leaf. These guys have figured out how to deal with that. And there's a bunch of other species like this, the large milkweed bugs, which by the way are migratory. Did you know that? I only learned this a couple years ago. These things migrate from north to south and back again, like monarchs, except in a simpler way. They don't have multiple stages. And then of course the monarchs, right? Monarch butterflies is what makes milkweed famous today. And monarchs can use all different kinds of milkweed species. So those 17 species of milkweed, any of those can support a monarch. They have favorites, but they can go on any of them, which is important for the story I'm going to tell you now. In 2017, we had a weird aberration in the migratory process for monarchs. Some of you might remember this. So typically monarchs that leave Nebraska in the fall, those individual monarchs go to Mexico, they hang out for the winter, and then they come back. Those same individuals come back into the US, but they come about a state or two north, and they lay eggs and then die in places like Oklahoma and Arkansas, right? Then the next generation hatches out and they come to Nebraska. So we usually see our first monarchs in May, maybe late April if we're lucky. In 2017, for whatever reason, we had monarchs that came all the way from Mexico into Nebraska. They just skipped over those southern states and came straight to Nebraska. And they were desperate to lay eggs because it was the time of year they need to lay eggs and then die. Well, it's cold in Nebraska in April, sometimes, not today. And there's not a lot blooming, right? So dandelions, which we just talked about, became very important for monarchs in 2017. They're not normally that important. But also, all the milkweed, the common milkweed, the big showy pink ones that everybody loves for monarchs, got hit by a frost in 2017 and were not available. So monarchs didn't have these available as an option. They're desperate to lay eggs. What are they going to do? Well, fortunately, there are 17 species of milkweed in Nebraska, and one of those is whorled milkweed, which has very skinny leaves and is not prone to frost or susceptible to frost and freezing as much as the bigger leaved ones. And so it was fine. It was still green and vibrant no matter what the temperature had been. And so we saw a lot of monarchs laying eggs on whorled milkweed in 2017, which is fantastic, right? And by the way, let's see if I can make this work. That little thing right there, that's an egg of a parasitoid, which is going to destroy that little caterpillar, which is sad for the caterpillar. But the parasitoid has a right also, right? So not only did the whorled milkweed help the monarch butterfly caterpillars, it also helped the parasitoids. So we're doing lots of good for lots of species by having lots of species of milkweed. We're supporting an entire ecosystem. That's great. And then we raised a bunch of monarch butterflies on whorled milkweed that went off to, raise more kids and go to Mexico and all that. And then the last example, before I get into a little bit of science and then back into photos again, is pollinators. And I want to start with pollinators by talking about bees, and I'm going to start with honeybees only so I can very quickly dismiss them and go on. So honeybees, most of you know, are not native to North America, right? They were brought in as a livestock species from Europe because we brought in crops from Europe and we brought the pollinator with them. That's all great. Honeybees are fascinating. They're amazing creatures. We all learned about them in school. In fact, it's probably the only bee you learned about in school, which means that most people coming out of school, when they think about bees, think about honeybees, and that's it. Unfortunately, honeybees are not great pollinators for most of our native wildflowers because they're not from here, and they're not adapted, and they're only one species. No one species can do everything. The other thing that's important to know about honeybees is, well, two things. One, they compete with our native bees, sometimes in a negative way, but also they're not going anywhere. So when you hear about pollinator crises or the collapse of the pollinator communities, don't include honeybees in that. Honeybees are going to be fine. So individual colonies can have trouble. There are diseases, there are pesticides that can affect colonies, and we're having more honeybee colonies just, collapse and die than we used to. You know what you do if you're a beekeeper and your honeybee colony collapses? You order another one. And so the species itself is not at risk because we are very carefully taking care of honeybees, and they're going to be fine. What's not going to be fine is all the other bees that are out there that we're not babysitting on a daily basis and taking care of, like bumblebees, for example, in which there are 20 different species of bumblebees in Nebraska, and all the other bees that are much smaller, in a lot of ways just as interesting or more interesting, There's probably 400 species of these other bees in Nebraska that are native, and in North America there's at least 4,000 or more species of these other bees. Most of those are solitary bees, meaning that they are a single mom with a nest in the ground usually, or in the hollow stem like Mark said earlier. Don't cut your stems yet, and even later in the season, keep them that tall from last year if you can. I've got a bunch of little bees in my yard that are nested in my ironweed stems from last year. And if you just keep them like 1.5 feet tall, and then watch, you'll get a bunch of little bees starting to nest in your stems. But they come in all different shapes and sizes and colors, just like milkweed. And again, most of them are nesting in the ground, and it's just a mom. So there's no worker bees, there's no soldiers to defend the nest. Nobody's taking care of the babies except the mom. So she goes out and collects all the pollen and nectar she can. She brings it back to the nest. She lays an egg. She puts the pollen and nectar next to the egg, seals it up in a little cell, does that a bunch of times. And she stacks those cells inside a tube. And then when she's not doing that, she's sitting at the edge of the nest defending it against all the bad things that are trying to get her eggs. And then if she dies, the nest dies, right? So just like the wasps we talked about, bees are not out to get you, and especially solitary bees are not out to get you. In fact, solitary bees have stingers, but they almost never use them because they can't afford to get into a fight. If they get into a fight and they die, the nest dies. So they would much rather go away, and they'll abandon their nest if they have to avoid getting into a fight. They'll try to intimidate something, but they usually won't sting it. And most wasps are also solitary like this because, again, they're the ancestors. So anyway, if you have a friend who is afraid of bees in their yard and is afraid to put a bunch of flowers out there because they're worried about bees, just tell them, A, if the bees are on the flowers, they really don't care about you. And even if they're not going to try to sting you because that's the end of them. Bumblebees will sting you. Honeybees will sting you. Some of the social bees, because they're the workers, right? They're not in charge of the whole thing. If a bumblebee stings you and you slap it and kill it, the nest is fine because they've got 768 other ones or whatever. But solitary bees are going to leave you alone. Anyway, most of these bees are very generalist. They'll feed on lots of different kinds of flowers, which is great for the flowers. Some of them, like this one, are very specialized. This is the blue sage bee, which only feeds on that flower species, which is called blue sage. And then there are some, everybody here knows about brown-headed cowbirds, right? Brood parasites, they lay their eggs in other birds' nests, which is a cool strategy. Cuckoo bees do the same thing. So there are cuckoo bees, there are cuckoo wasps also, of course, because they're, again, ancestors, who just go around and lay their eggs in other bees' nests and then leave, and their kids get fed by the parents, which is really sweet. And a lot of times, if you can recognize one by the fact that they spend the night holding on to a stem or a leaf with their mouth, and they'll do that all night long. So if you ever see a tiny little bee holding onto a stem with its mouth in the early morning, there's a good chance that it's a cuckoo bee. So, from a resilience standpoint, you have to have a lot of flower species to support bees because these bees are out for a good part of the season. Some of them are out all season, some of them are out for a month or two, and no flower is going to bloom for that entire period, right? So you have to have a lot of different kinds of flowers so that you always have something blooming. And not every bee can use every flower, which makes it even more important to have lots of flower species. From the flower standpoint, you need lots of bees because if one species of bee has a bad year, you need others to be able to fill in the job and do the job so you can make seeds. So if you have both of those two things, then you have a good, healthy ecosystem almost every time. So the fact that people are excited about pollinators right now is great for conservation because if pollinators are doing well, ecosystems in general are probably doing well too. They have very similar needs. Okay, I'm going to talk real quick about science. And I want to start with the idea that most people in the general public, I think, when they think about nature or they think about something that's natural, what that means to them is it's separate from people, right? Wilderness is a place you go to get away from people. Ecosystems are better off if we just get people out of there and let them do their thing. Let nature take its course. There's a balance in nature, all right? Almost none of that is true. So if you look at prairies especially, prairies are a great example of this because prairies in the Midwest and the Great Plains, but especially in the Midwest, a little bit to the east of us, probably wouldn't exist without people. So as the last glaciers receded and went north and the Ice Age ended, indigenous people had already been here for at least 10,000 years at that point, maybe longer, depending on who you ask. And they were very intentionally and very intensively managing land, especially with fire, right? They were burning land all the time for fire for a lot of different reasons, but partly to attract bison or to affect habitat. They were cultivating plants, they were moving plants around, they were doing a lot of intentional management. And then for the next 10,000 years after that, they continued to do that. And they continue to do it today. And a lot of the prairies that we have in the east right now wouldn't have been prairies without that fire that was all set by people. There were some lightning fires too, but if you look at the data, lightning fires in most places, except for like the southeast part of the US, are much less important than people set fires and had much less impact. So people really created prairies in a lot of places, and even where they didn't create them, they maintained them and kept them healthy for many, many, many years. There's two reasons that's important. One, we need to give the people that have been doing this for a long time the respect that they deserve for managing these sites and doing it well. And also, we have a continued responsibility to do that now, right? So we as people in this room and everybody else has a responsibility to grasslands to keep managing them, because it's not something we can walk away from and expect to be okay. I just wanted to say that because I think this is something that, wilderness is a European concept, and the idea of nature being separate from people in many ways is a European concept. And most of the rest of the world knows that that's not the way it works. And if you look at other places, I put this paper up there. This is a paper that talks about at least 30,000 years, at least 3/4 of the earth has been significantly impacted by people for that 30,000 years or so. That's a really different story than most people think about when they think about nature. Okay, so when we think about people managing nature, what we really want to do in that management is facilitate resilience, because all these systems are resilient, but they need a little bit of help to maintain that resilience. And when I talk about resilience, what I'm talking about here is not stability in terms of like if something happens, it comes right back to what it was before. Resilience in nature, and especially in prairies, is more about a range of stability. So think about a prairie like a ball here, and think about the stability, the range of stability like a bowl. And that ball is inside that bowl and it's rolling around. And it gets pushed around by disturbances like fire or grazing or drought or anything or other things, right? And so if you walk out to a prairie one day, it might look very different than it did last year or even yesterday, because there's things happening to that prairie that make it look different, and it pushes it around in that bowl. It becomes something really, it has a lot of variation in what it can look like and what it can do. But as long as it's still within the bowl, it's the same prairie, it's providing the same services, it's providing the same functions, it's supporting the same kinds of species, because it's still in the same bowl. We can push it too far, and then it goes into a different bowl. And when it's in that different bowl, it can be really difficult to go backwards. And it's almost impossible to go back, because it's not a linear process. Just because you go back here, we can't stop doing what we did and have it come back to where it was. Once it goes out of that threshold, all bets are off. So as an example of that, here's a prairie that has left the bowl, right? That's not a bowl, that's not in the same bowl anymore, it's not the same prairie. You can't just stop farming this and expect the prairie to come right back. It doesn't work that way. Also, this is a site that's out of the bowl. This is a little trickier because the threshold is a little harder to identify sometimes, because you can have a prairie with trees for a long time, and then eventually, one day it becomes a woodland with openings. And a prairie with trees and a woodland with openings are very different, right? Different species are supported, the soil properties are different, everything is different functionally within those two, but the edges there can be really hard to define. But at some point it changes, and it goes from one bowl to another. And it won't go back. If you let a prairie get to that state, and then you go to cut all those trees, it might go back to grassland, especially if you burn it a lot. But there's a lot of things that have changed fundamentally that either won't change back on their own, or will take a lot of effort from us to get to happen. It'll take a very long time. Where it gets really tricky is in a grassland system that has become degraded over time through broadcast herbicide use or overgrazing for a long time or whatever, and it starts to lose a lot of species. At some point, that also, I am pretty convinced, moves to a different bowl. And the reason I think that is we have sites like this that I manage, that manages the Nature Conservancy. You probably have had experience with some of this. And you do everything you know is right, but the diversity doesn't come back, which I think is the indication that it's moved to a different bowl. And it's even trickier than the trees, because it's really hard to know where that line is. So at that point, I think it's in a new stable state, and we're in trouble. So as land managers, I think the job is to keep the ball in the bowl, But also, it's to move the ball around in the bowl, because if you don't move the ball around in the bowl shrinks. So you really have to keep pushing it around to keep the bowl wide to give us some room to play with and to let that prairie be resilient and be able to adapt and respond to disturbances when they come. And then, of course, it's not a linear thing. It's more like a ball in an egg carton, but that doesn't have the same ring to it. But I wanted to show this anyway. So the ball can go in lots of different directions. That's the point, okay? You wouldn't believe how long it took me to make this little stupid graphic. So how do you maintain resilience? Basically, you do it by species diversity. We've already talked about sunflowers and milkweed and bees, and the reason that lots of species is important, right? There's a lot of redundancy there in the system, so if you lose one species, there are other species that can help fill in the gap. Species diversity, very important. Plants, animals, everything. Fungi, bacteria, doesn't matter. And then habitat size is really big because, it's really important because a large population is much easier to keep around. If something happens, it's a lot less likely that a big population is going to completely disappear than a small one, right? That makes sense. Also, in a big patch, these little hills here, you might have a species that likes to live on the south-facing slope of a hill. And if something happens on one hill and that wipes out that species, there's other south-facing slopes nearby, so there's other populations they can move back in and repopulate. And if you can't have size, you need connectivity, right? Road ditches, stream corridors, all these other things that can connect habitat patches together to allow populations to either be bigger or at least to interact with other populations. So, species diversity, habitat size, habitat connectivity. The way we keep that around is keep the habitat we have, restore the habitat that's been lost, and then manage the habitat well for species diversity especially where we have it. So restoration can kind of make patches bigger again and reconnect some things, but the management is what's going to keep us going for a long time. So I want to focus on that really fast. And I've talked about this before, so I'm going to skim through this pretty quickly, but we can talk about it later if you have questions. But really, the way that we manage at the Nature Conservancy, and I think the way that most habitat managers with prairies now are thinking is habitat heterogeneity is what we focus on, because if you have heterogeneous habitat, that facilitates the species diversity that we need to make ecological resilience. So people that aren't familiar with prairies think they're all the same everywhere. But they might look at forests and know that there's a canopy and an understory and a shrub layer and a ground layer and all those sorts of layers. Those same layers are true in prairies too, they're just a little bit more condensed. So you can have tall, dense vegetation, you can have patchy vegetation, you can have uniformly short vegetation, you can have really weird mixes of habitat like short grass with tall wildflowers. And most of those are managed with fire, but also with cattle or bison, which we use as habitat artists, right? So we use those big grazing animals to sculpt the habitat in different ways to support different kinds of species, because otherwise, I don't know how you create this habitat. Without a selective grazer who's making choices every bite, what plant to eat, what plant not to eat. If you're really good with loppers or a weed whacker, maybe you can do this, but not on a very big scale. Cattle do it for free. In fact, the person that owns the cattle will pay you to have them do it on your site. It's a really good deal. It's a scam like the tree thing. Don't tell anybody. So who cares? Why do we need all the different kinds of habitat? It matters because different birds use different habitat structures, right? But the same thing is true with insects, and really the same thing is true with plants. So plants need different kinds of growing conditions. Some do better with more light, less light, more competition, less competition. And so if you create all those different kinds of habitats, that's a really good thing. The next thing that has to happen is, though, they have to move around the landscape. You can't have a static situation. Same reason we rotate crops. If you have the same thing in the same place for lots of years, you build up predators and disease species and parasites and all these other things sort of accumulate in one spot. But if you can shift the conditions around, you keep everything a little bit off kilter, and the system just works better. So what we really want to do is we want to create all these different habitats on the landscape and then shift them around from year to year. Again, really cool animation, right? So here's an example of what it can look like on a landscape. This is one of our sites on the Platte for the Nature Conservancy. And in the time that I took this photo with a drone, there were 4 different types of patches of habitat structure, right? Anything from very short to very tall, and then some things in the middle. And then next year, if you take that same photo, everything will be in a different place, because the short areas are allowed to recover, the tall areas get grazed down, and then everything sort of moves around. So what it can look like on the ground, here's a patch that was burned in the spring, grazed really hard all summer, and then so what you see here is all the grass has had a tough year. A lot of the wildflowers have also been grazed, but not all of them, including sunflowers, by the way, to bounce back to sunflowers. Here's the same spot a year later. So there's a wildflower party going on because the grasses are suppressed. They're not as strong as they normally are. There's a lot of grass in here. It's not dead. It didn't kill the grass. But that grass that you see there, that's big blue stem, and this is a late July photo. Big blue stem in late July is usually this tall, right? But when it's been grazed for an entire season by cattle, it doesn't have the energy to grow 6 feet tall. It has the energy to grow about that tall. And its roots are much less dense. And so when that happens, all these other species get to come out and play for a year or two until the grass comes back, and then they go away, and then other things happen. This prairie, this is exactly the same prairie just across the fire break. This didn't get burned and grazed the previous year. Cattle were there, but they didn't spend a lot of time there because they went to the burned area, just like the bison we talked about earlier. This is also a healthy prairie, but it's a very different habitat than that and than that, right? But all three of these are available at all times on our sites so that species can go, if they're an animal, they can go to where they want to go. If they're a plant, if they don't like this, they just have to wait a year or two and something different will come along and they can thrive. And then just as a last example, this is our family prairie. And we have 4 big pastures in the prairie. And this is what it looked like in 2018, I think this is from. So the different 4 pastures. Just look at how much of the shovel blade you can see, and that'll tell you kind of what the habitat conditions are like. Very different from place to place. Okay, the reason all that works is that prairies are resilient. So we can help them maintain that resilience, but they are resilient. Plant communities especially are really tough. One of the reasons for that is that they have diversity, but also because they don't all rely on seeds as their only way to replace themselves in the system. Annuals rely on seeds, but perennials have buds. And so you hear about the seed bank and how important the seed bank is. It's kind of important. The bud bank is actually more important. So at the base of all these perennials, grasses, wildflowers, whatever, there are these little buds. Those buds are next year's plants, right? They're the shoots that come up next year. Or if something like grazing or fire happens in the middle of the season this year, they'll deploy a bud and start a new shoot this year too. But that's the future. The buds are the future. And so as long as a perennial plant has the opportunity to make enough energy to produce new buds, it'll live and just live and live and live. And there's no reason it should ever die. Especially because a lot of these perennial plants also have rhizomes. Rhizomes are the underground stems that allow them to spread and become bigger, right? And they can infiltrate large areas with these rhizomes. And on those rhizomes, there are also buds. Those buds can become roots, they can become shoots, but those are the new sort of the kids, except that they're not kids because they're the same individual plant. It's the same plant. And if you think about that, some of these rhizomatous plants can grow and grow and grow, and over thousands of years, they can be, tens, hundreds of acres in size. One plant, one individual plant. How are you going to kill that thing? Which means things like big blue stem are probably some of the oldest plants on the earth, but we don't have a way to prove it because they don't have tree rings. So trees get all the credit for being really old organisms. Big blue stem should blow them out of the water. We just can't prove it at this point because they don't have tissue that they keep that you can count. Also, just little insignificant looking things like pussy toes, right? It's a rhizomatous plant that can form patches that just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger every year. This is our family prairie. We've got, half an acre or more size patches of these little pussy toes, which, by the way, are not only one of the first things that bloom every year and provide habitat for pollinators, they're also allelopathic, meaning they have chemical defenses. So they secrete chemicals into the soil that suppress the grass growth, which helps them because they're short little plants, and also makes grazing more attractive because the grasses are shorter and they look better to cows, which keeps the grass shorter even then. It's just a cool little system. That is the flower. That is the flower. Yep. That's as good as it gets. Sorry to disappoint you.
Well, I didn't know, I've never seen them.
Yeah. Oh, they're amazing. And there's actually, the other thing with pussy toes, they're male and female flowers. So these are the female flowers. The male plants have their own flowers, and they're much shorter even than that, even less important. And the male ones are the ones that actually look like little cat feet, which is where the name pussy toes comes from.
Is that a Nebraska native that
Yep.
here? I mean, I've
Yep.
never seen them before.
Yeah. It is, and you see them mostly in grazed areas because that interaction between grazers and the grass defense really works well. Okay, speaking of resilient and tough, this is a spadefoot. People call them spadefoot toads, which is kind of correct, but on the spectrum of toad to frog, spadefoots are really more frog than toad, but they're not really either one exactly. So you can call them a spadefoot toad. I won't be offended, neither will they. But they're tough because they only come out of the ground when it rains. So most of their life they spend underground, and after the rain, they start digging themselves in, and they just slowly sort of disappear into the ground, and they'll stay there for months at a time. So that whole process right there, that happened over about 3 minutes. So here we'll reverse and we'll pull him back out of the ground. And what they're doing is they just kind of wiggle their back feet around, and they sort of dig out underneath them with their back feet, and they just sink right into the ground. It was amazing to watch. And then at the end of the process, it just looks like that. That's a tough animal right there, right? There's another tough animal that eats that animal, which is called a hognose snake. Hognose snakes really like toads. Hognose snakes would also like you to think that they're very dangerous. So this one has flattened its head to look like a viper, and it's coiled up, and it's making a sound that sounds a lot like a rattlesnake because it's inflating and deflating its body in a like that. It's really intimidating. And they want you to run away. If you don't run away, who knows what happens? They flip over on their back and they roll around and they look like they're dying, and then they sort of land like they're dead, and they pretend you're dead, and they'll just stare at you until you go away. And it's like, why are you still here? I'm dead.
What's it called?
A hognose snake. And the reason it's a hognose snake, see its little upturned nose there? Like a little pig. So that's a hognose snake. They're really amazing creatures too.
They often throw up a toad too.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. They'll throw up a toad just because they're putting on a show. Everything you can do.
Is that around here or more out west?
Both. Yeah, in fact, there's an eastern and a western hognose snake that are just different varieties of the same species in Nebraska. Easterns are a little darker color, westerns a little lighter color. Anybody know what these are? Good. These are sunflower tortoise beetle larvae. Okay, so there's a beetle called the sunflower tortoise beetle, and these are the larvae. Those tails right there that you see waving around in the air, those are filled with poop. Why are they filled with poop? They're filled with poop because you can wave poop over the top of your head and keep predators away. If you don't believe me, try it. It works. So these little creatures sit there and wave poop around over the top of their heads to keep predators off. That's a tough animal too, right? That's a smart, tough, cool.
Are they eating the plant? Is that
Yes.
how they get the poop?
No, yeah, right. So they eat the plant, turn that into poop, put the poop in their tail, wave it over their heads. You got it, exactly. This is an oil beetle. This oil beetle is eating a pasque flower. And oil beetles are a kind of blister beetle. You've probably seen blister beetles. You see them a lot on goldenrod, little black beetles. This is just a big version of a blister beetle. Oil beetles and most other blister beetles have larvae called triungulin. They're a hyperactive little larva stage. There's like an extra stage of larvae that are very quick and they're very small, not like the big beetle grubs that you think of that just sort of move around very slowly. What these do, when they hatch out of the eggs, all the larvae kind of come together and they form a ball of themselves, and they release a scent into the air that smells exactly like the scent that a female bee also puts into the air. What's the female bee trying to do? Attract males. Same thing here. So a male bee follows the scent to this little ball of larvae. He lands all horny and excited, and all those little larvae crawl up onto the bee. Good things are going to happen, just wait. So then the male bee flies off with all these little hitchhikers, right? They're not going to hurt the male bee. They're going to wait until the male bee finds the female bee and starts to mate with the female bee, and then they jump off onto the female bee, and they ride the female bee back to her nest, and then they go down into the nest, and they hop off, and they eat all the babies in the nest. It's really sad. But you know what? Oil beetles are amazing, and we need them around too. Everybody's got a chance. So they don't get all of them, but it's a really neat strategy, right? Who knows what this is? Leafhopper is close. It's not a leafhopper, but it's close. Does it help if I show you what the face looks like? No, it doesn't. Not plant hopper. Nope. One name for them is frog hopper. But does this help? Spittlebug. Spittlebug is the other name. So frog hopper or spittlebug, that's what they look like as adults. You hardly ever see them or notice them because they're just hiding in the vegetation. But you always see them when they look like this, right? So this, there's a larva underneath that feeding on the stem of the plant. And in this case, converting what they're eating to just these little bubbles that come out the back end. And it allows them to get rid of waste, but also kind of create a little protective barrier that keeps them from desiccating and also keeps predators away. That's a really cool strategy.
Now, that's really enlarged, isn't it?
Yes, it's about the size of a nickel, maybe a little bit bigger, depending on which one. And I want to talk about flies. I'm almost done so we can get to the video that you've all been waiting for. But I want to talk about flies. What kind of fly is this? Yeah, no, it's not. You don't know. I don't know. I have no idea what kind of fly this is. Do you know that there are 61,000 kinds of flies in North America? Just in North America, 61,000 species of flies. Name some fly species. Go. Housefly we got. Name another one.
Horseflies.
Nope. Those are a kind of fly. That's not a species. Name a species of fly. Nope. Hoverfly is a kind of fly. Tachinids are a kind of fly. Fruit flies are a kind of fly. Name another fly species. Anybody. Just one. Nope. That's a fruit fly. You can't do it. And there are 61,000 choices. And I've never ever given a presentation where we can get past 2. That's pretty crazy because we don't pay attention to flies, and we should. So this is a fly of some kind. I think it's a flesh fly, but I could be wrong. Here's a little fruit fly. This is a long-legged fly. There's a species you can remember, long-legged fly. It's a predator. It eats ants. We talked about ants earlier. This is a fly that lays its eggs in thistles, so the babies can eat the seeds of thistles. It's also gorgeous. A lot of flies are pollinators and nectar and pollen feeders. Here's a little hoverfly or flower fly feeding on buffalo grass. Here's another one feeding on prairie cordgrass pollen. So it's not just the wildflowers they'll eat the pollen of grasses as well. There are things like crane flies, which look like really long-legged and big mosquitoes. They're not mosquitoes. They won't hurt you. Also, mosquitoes are flies. So if you could have named a species of mosquito, that would have counted. Anybody know a species of mosquito? That's what I thought. This is a stilt-legged fly with little white hands, which is cute. This is a tachinid fly. We had a couple people talk about tachinid flies. Tachinids are parasitoids, so they'll lay their eggs on another creature, and then the egg hatches and goes into the creature, like the one we saw in the monarch earlier, and they feed on it from the inside out and kill it eventually, which you think is gross and sad, but it's really important, just for the same reason that predators are important. These are major controls on insect outbreaks. Parasitoids are really important. But my favorite flies are the robber flies. These are the predators. These are the surface-to-air missiles that launch themselves off of a perch or off of the ground, and as soon as they see something move and come into the air, they'll just take out, and they'll either catch it in the air or they'll knock it out of the air. So this one caught a little leafhopper and is feeding on it now. It feeds on it by injecting it with a venom that liquefies and paralyzes it at the same time, and then it just sucks the juices out, discards the carcass in a very clean and neat way. We should all be so neat and tidy with our food. Here's one, though, that knocked down a cicada out of the ground that was many times its weight and size. And my daughter and I actually had this happen. We saw it, or we heard it happen. We were walking through the prairie in the sandhills. We heard a cicada get up and start to fly. And it only went about that long, and then it suddenly stopped, which is weird, because it should go longer than that. And I said, let's go look at that. We turned around, we went. It took us a while to find it, but we found it on the ground, sort of just like that, with this robber fly. And the robber fly had to search for a little chink in the armor to be able to stick its little mouth part in. And as soon as it did, then it subdued it and paralyzed it and liquefied it and sucked the juice out, all that kind of thing. And here's one that caught another predator. This is a tiger beetle, which is also a major predator. And I saw this happen too. I was trying to get a picture of the stupid tiger beetle, and it kept moving on me. And it's gorgeous, and I really wanted a picture. And then about the third time it flew, a robber fly came out of nowhere, knocked it down to the ground, and I got a picture of the tiger beetle, but not the one I was expecting. And then sometimes it's just not fair. This is a fly. This is a robber fly that looks like a bumblebee, and that poor beetle was feeding on a flower, probably saw the robber fly and thought, Bumblebees. Bumblebees are my friends. Bumblebees don't hurt anybody. And that was the last thought that ever went through the head of that beetle. Speaking of flies that look like bees, this is a bee fly. It's just called a bee fly. It looks kind of like a bee. It's got this long proboscis that it'll stick into a flower, and it can pull nitrogen. It can pull pollen and nectar out of the flower with that stiff proboscis. It's a little tiny beetle. It's a little leaf beetle of some kind. Don't ask me to identify beetles. I don't know. We're going to come back to that bee fly in just a second. Here's the lubber. Again, remember the mouse-sized grasshopper we talked about? I just want you to appreciate how pretty they are. They're really pretty. Also, other grasshoppers are pretty. This is a barber pole grasshopper or a painted grasshopper that lives in western states, western prairies. Gorgeous. Doesn't look super camouflaged, does it? But remember what leopards look like, right? Leopards are very camouflaged, even though they're colorful, because that pattern works really well in a grass-shade combination. And so these are really hard to see when they're in the vegetation, even though they're very colorful. But not as hard to see as these. This is the sagewort grasshopper that feeds on white sage or cudweed sagewort. It matches that plant in such an amazing way. You won't see them unless what you do to find them is you find a patch of that white sage, just sort of nudge it around with your foot, and if little white things hop out of there, then you're set, and you can go find them and look at them. Otherwise, I don't know how you'd ever find them. And that's also their favorite food. Okay, but that brings us back to bee flies. So if you don't like grasshoppers, if you think grasshoppers are ugly, or you think they're pests, which, by the way, any idea how many species of grasshoppers are in Nebraska? More than 5. 108, maybe 110. I think there's a couple new species that have just recently been added. So let's say 108 species to be conservative. About a handful of them are categorized as pests. I think all of those are native. They're just taking advantage of corn, for example, where we say, hey, here's a food you like, and here's lots of it. What do we expect them to do, right? And we've always had grasshopper populations that cycle up and down. It's just part of grassland ecology. But it's a lot harder to take that when you're a rancher trying to make your living off the grass. So we have some conflicts with a few grasshopper species, but most of them we have no issues with. A lot of them don't even eat grass. But if you don't like grasshoppers, here's a friend. Bee flies, at least some species of bee flies, when grasshoppers lay their eggs, they sit on the ground and they put their little rear end into the soil and they make a little tunnel and they bury their eggs in the ground, right? Bee flies will find them when they're doing that. They'll hover right above them and they'll flick their little bee fly eggs onto the ground next to the grasshopper. When the grasshopper leaves and the bee fly egg hatches, the larva crawls down into the tunnel where the grasshopper eggs are and eats the grasshoppers. Again, not sad, really cool. Okay, but grasshoppers don't like it. So look at this grasshopper and notice the length of the antenna. Okay, short antenna. This is not a grasshopper. Okay, this is a katydid because it has long antenna. So if you see something that looks like a grasshopper but has really long antenna, like as long as its body or so, that's a katydid. And they come in all different shapes and sizes also. Here's a little baby nymph katydid. I don't know how they walk around. I don't know how they walk around with those. And there are bush cicadas, bush katydids that look a lot like leaves. And one thing about katydids that's different than grasshoppers also is that where they hear from. Anybody know what they hear through? What part of their body they use to listen with? Their legs. In fact, their elbow. So that little hole right there on their elbow is where they listen. Just that little hole on their front legs. Grasshoppers and katydids, besides being really amazing animals, are also an incredibly important food source. So if you like birds, that's one of the big things that birds feed their kids and get through the summer on. Those and caterpillars make up a huge proportion of food for birds during the summer. All right, I'm going to end now with the way I always end these presentations, which is my favorite insect in the world, the camouflaged looper. How many people have heard me talk about the camouflaged looper before? Okay, good. I'm not going to bore the rest of you. Camouflage looper is a little inchworm. It's a little less than an inchworm. That was a joke. You can laugh, it's okay. It feeds on flowers. And as it feeds on flowers, what it does is it takes a little bit of the flower that it's eating and it turns around and it sticks it to its back as a disguise. So that flower right there in the bottom, that's purple prairie clover. This caterpillar is eating purple prairie clover. That's not the caterpillar, those are flowers on its back. And then as those dry up, it'll replace them with fresh examples, so it keeps itself looking good.
How do they get them on there?
So it gets them on there because there are little spikes on the back, and it has sticky saliva. And the combination of those two things is how it sticks them on. But when it switches flowers, it switches its costume to match. So here's a black-eyed Susan with one on it that looks like a black-eyed Susan. And then here's one that I found up at the Niobrara Valley Preserve on a sunflower. Here it is eating a piece of that sunflower like a little ice cream cone because they're amazing little animals and very cute. So when I found this, it was late in the day, and I wanted to take it back so that the rest of the staff at the preserve could see it. And they were all gone for the night, but I was staying overnight. So I just took the whole sunflower with me, and I took it back, and I put it in a jar or in a glass with some water, and I grabbed another flower of a different species to put it in there with it, because I thought, well, if I do that, maybe it'll change costumes overnight. That'd be fun, right? And then I took a glass to put over the top of it. But before I did that, I took a paper towel, and I put the paper towel across the top of the glass because I didn't want the little thing to fall in the water and drown, right? I was trying to be nice. Put the glass over the top. Then I went to bed. The next morning I got up, and the first thing I thought was, I'm going to go see if that thing changed its costume. This is going to be great. It did change its costume. It did not change the costume to the flower. Now, if you can't love an insect that does that, I can't help you. That's an amazing creature that everybody should love. Good luck ever finding one, but they're probably in your yard, almost certainly. They're a pretty common animal. They're just really hard to find. I've only seen a handful of them in my life, but they're found throughout most of the US. They just are really good at doing what they do, so they hide. So anyway, that's the camouflage looper. That's why you should be excited about prairies. Questions? That's the larva. The adult is a green moth called the wavy-lined emerald. It's fine. This is the cool part.
Well, do they go through all the steps like the other
Yep.
ones do?
Yep. They'll form a cocoon and turn into a moth. And
Oh, you needed to have a picture of that.
I should have the adult. I do have a picture of the adult. I didn't throw it in. I thought this was enough. I'm sorry. So anyway, thank you very much.
If you have a question, raise your hand and I'll give you a microphone, and that way we can get it recorded. Bruce, we got.
Hi, Chris.
Hey, Bruce.
Thank you so much. That was great. What can you tell us about why and how grasshoppers get airborne and cause those plagues that we read about in historic accounts?
Well, so most of the grasshoppers that you read about in like Little House on the Prairie books were locusts, right, which are related to grasshoppers. The Rocky Mountain locust is the one that we had in North America. It's been extinct for a long time. We don't know for sure why it went extinct, probably because of habitat fragmentation and habitat loss. There are still locusts in other parts of the world that do those same kinds of big migrations. In terms of why they do it or how they do it, I'm not the person to ask. I don't know. I've read the story and I've forgotten most of it. I remember that it was a fascinating story. I just don't remember the details enough to tell you. Sorry. Yes.
So you didn't mention praying mantis.
I did not mention praying mantis. I did have a photo of it. You saw that at the beginning. My opening slide is a praying mantis. Yeah, praying mantises are really neat. There's a handful of species in Nebraska. Some of them don't look like the ones we think about. Like they're a lot shorter. They just live on the ground. They're a different, like they're a mantis, but somewhat different kind. The native praying mantis that looks like the praying mantis you think of is the Carolina mantis. That's the one that's native in Nebraska. It's about half the size of the mantises that we most often see, which are the great big ones, right? The Chinese mantis or the European mantis, both of which are non-native and invasive. They're really cool, but they're invasive. And they are having an impact on insect communities. There's some amazing studies that have been done that show that when a Chinese mantis is in a site, it changes the composition of spider species in the site. Like there are spider species that leave the area because the praying mantis is there. We don't know why. I don't think it's because the spiders are getting eaten. I think it's because the prey is getting affected. So I guess you could make a really good argument that every time you see one of those big mantises, you should squish it. I can't bring myself to do that. For the same reason I don't pull cowbird eggs out of nests. Well, not for the same reason. For multiple, that's illegal for one thing. Don't do that. But anyway, it's important to know. But they're one of the few animals or insects that can turn its head 180 degrees, which makes it really charming. If you get it in the right mood, it'll like rear up and defend itself and spread its wings out and make it look really cool. And they're really well camouflaged. Yeah, they're fascinating. Was there anything else you wanted me to say about them?
More? You talk about cattle and bison on the prairie.
Yeah.
You don't mention goats or hogs or...
Yep. So goats and hogs, I don't know as much about hogs because we don't have a lot of free-range goat or hogs around anymore, and none that I've had a chance to look at and study. Goats are really interesting, of course, because they eat wildflowers or forbs, broadleaf plants, right? Preferably, where cows eat grasses. So cows are mostly looking for grass, bison are looking for grass, goats and sheep are looking for forbs or broadleaf plants. Which means that there are some times where goats can be helpful if you have an invasive plant, especially shrubs, they like shrubs. The problem with goats, there's two issues with goats that I have. One is they don't kill the plants, right? So if you have a shrub in your site or a bunch of shrubs and you bring goats in, especially if you bring them in for a short period of time, they'll eat all those shrubs down, and then you pull the goats out and the shrubs grow back. And then you bring the goats back in and they eat the shrubs down, and then you pull them out and the shrubs come back. We're not winning. But they can still be useful. Like, I mean, that process can be helpful, especially if you're trying to kill the shrubs and you can't manage to kill them all at once. Having the goats keep some of them knocked down while you're killing others, that's a good idea. But don't get into the idea that you're just going to get rid of your shrubs with goats doing that. That's probably not going to work, at least not in 10 or 20 years. Doesn't make goats good or bad, just that's the thing. One of the things that's interesting with goats that they're trying in the southern U.S. now, where they have a major shrub problem that's coming our way, is using goats year-round. So they put cattle out in pasture, and they'll put a few goats out there too, and they'll keep the goats out there for the whole season at a small number. The challenge there is fencing, because goats can get out of anything. But from a functional standpoint, what they're seeing, which is really interesting, is they'll hit those same shrubs time after time after time throughout the season, and that's how we're going to get rid of those shrubs. So that could work, but the fencing is a really big issue. My other big issue with goats, at least the way they're used in Nebraska, is that when I bring cattle onto my property, the person that owns the cattle is paying me to feed their cows. It makes plenty of sense, right? But if I work with somebody who's got goats and they want to bring their goats on my property, they want me to pay them for their goats to eat my food. What are we doing? That's a scam. It's not a scam. It's the system that's set up, and I don't like it. I feel like that doesn't make a lot of sense. The reason that they tell you that they're doing it is probably legitimate, which is, there's not a big market for goats here. It's harder to make money. It's really expensive to manage goats. They, anything will eat them and they'll die easily, and they can get out of fences and all that stuff. But anyway, that's a lot about goats. Yeah.
You mentioned the fire you had on your big prairie, 35,000 acres of 50-something thousand?
Yeah.
So plants are really resilient. What about amphibians, reptiles? How did they do? It looked really terrible, I have to admit.
Yeah, it's a good question. So the question was about the size of that wildfire. I mean, the quick answer is we don't know, because that's hard to study, right? The better answer is that when you have a landscape like the Sandhills, a 35,000 acre fire is big, but it's not a huge proportion, right? Which is probably good, because you're right. And I mean, but any fire at any time of year is going to have negative impacts on something, right? Dormant season fire has an impact on any insect that's overwintering above ground, which a lot of them do. And then if you wait till the growing season fire is going to potentially impact things that are alive and moving around in the vegetation. They can't either fly out of the way or dig into the ground. So every fire has a negative impact, but they also have positive impacts, and what you hope is that one outweighs the other, right? I think historically, when you think about the indigenous fires that were used at a large scale, the landscape was very intact. So even at 35,000 acres, there's plenty of space and time for things to come back in. But you're absolutely right. Things like box turtles, if they couldn't get underground, are very vulnerable because they're not super fast. Lizards are probably fine, they can get down. Amphibians are probably okay most of the time, because a lot of them either live in around the blowouts in the Sandhills that aren't going to burn, so they can get to there, or if they're living near moist areas that the fire intensity is less. It's not that they're safe, but they're probably relatively safe. I think the vulnerable things are the animals that can't move, eggs, nestlings for birds, turtles, non-flying insects, that sort of thing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Yes.
One thing I need to have.
Oh, hang on. You gotta. Yeah, you do, because there's people on the computer trying to watch.
Oh.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry about that. One thing I want to know is, when you're driving down the highways anymore, you don't get as many insects on the windows? And is climate change affecting, have you noticed anything changing about that yet?
Yeah, I'm not qualified to answer that question, but it's a thing. I mean, a lot of people are noticing it. We don't have a ton of long-term studies that are looking at insect populations over time because it's really hard to study, and they're really variable. The people that have looked at that, you know, there's so many factors that are involved, and it's probably all of them combined. It's habitat loss, it's habitat fragmentation, it's changes in pesticide use, it's climate change, it's all of that, right? Here's the hopeful way to look at this, I think, is that insects can decline quickly, but they're also really good at expanding quickly. So populations of insects can go up and down really quickly from year to year, which means they can recover fast. And a lot of them, like we have very few examples of insect species that we know have gone extinct. Very few. Like I can't think of any in Nebraska that we know have gone extinct. We have the American burying beetle that's listed as an endangered species, but it's still around. Like up at the Niobrara Valley Preserve, we had a guy come up and look and he found like 40 of them in a day, you know? So insects are super abundant, which makes them pretty resilient as a group. The problem, of course, is that if we have fewer of them, all the functions that they do have been decreased, and that's the issue. But the optimistic way to look at it, I think, is that insects as a group and invertebrates as a group are pretty resilient and can withstand a lot. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to fix our habitat loss and habitat fragmentation issues, right? But anyway, yeah, I don't know much more than that.
We'll do one more question. Got a question in the back? You have a question? Anybody else have a question?
Does he need a
Here
microphone?
we go.
You got a microphone for him in the back? Oh, he's got a microphone. Go ahead, and then we'll. I'm passing it around. Oh, okay, go ahead.
What got you most interested in insects, like photographing them and learning more about them?
What got me interested in insects was photographing them.
Okay, so what got you interested in photography?
What got me interested in photographing insects was getting a macro lens to photograph insects. Yeah, so, but that is really the answer, which is that when I started as a photographer, I was taking pictures of flowers and landscapes and things, but you know, when I got a macro lens, all of a sudden a whole new world opened up, right? And you know this, you've done this. And it's like having a microscope everywhere you go that you can also take pictures with out in the field, which is just an amazing thing. And you see a whole bunch of things that you wouldn't see otherwise. And so that started me on the path. And then with insects, what's great with insects now is if you get a good picture of an insect, you can post it on a website like Bug Guide, and bugguide.net will identify it for you. They've got a bunch of experts that'll take your picture, they'll figure out what it is, they'll email you back, and then they'll add it to their database so other people can learn about it. And so then you can learn the species. And once you have the species, you can look it up, and Google will tell you lots of things about it most of the time, or at least some of its relatives. And then you can tell stories about the things that you tell about. Here's the problem now, is that everybody assumes that I'm an insect expert because I've got a bunch of pictures of insects. The pictures of insects are the ones that I know about. If I don't have a picture of it, I probably don't know anything about it. Locusts, for example. But it's not a huge problem. But that's really the answer, right? So once you start looking, you start finding them. Once you start finding them, you learn the stories behind them. Once you learn the stories behind them, you're hooked, which is why storytelling is so important, right? Which is why PBT is important, which is why the work that all of you do is important. And everyone in here can be a storyteller. Tell the story that you know, tell it in your way to the people you interact with. That's how we're going to get conservation done. How about that for taking that question and twisting it?
Well, let's give a big hand tonight. Thank you, Chris. Remember, we're going to do the wetland videos now. We'll take a couple minutes to set the wetland videos up with Ethan and Dakota. So you're welcome to go out and grab a glass of water, some tea, hot tea, some snacks. Ask Chris a couple questions, but we'll get that video set up here in a minute or two, and then we'll reconvene. So thanks for coming tonight.